Greetings from Indian Council of Medical Research. I'll be speaking on the National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Health Research involving human participants. ICMR is the apex body to formulate, conduct, coordinate, promote and fund research. But along with funding and promoting research, ICMR also promotes ethical values in any biomedical and health research that is conducted across the country. And it was way back in 1980 when ICMR had prepared a pink book called as the Policy Statement, and that was the first ethical guideline. This was revised in the year 2000 and then 2006, and finally now we have the National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Health Research involving human participants, which has recently been released. The preparation of these national ethical guidelines has been a very participatory process involving a large number of stakeholders. There were a number of committees with experts, with people from variety of backgrounds. So there was a core advisory committee that prepared the draft of the document, and then there were subcommittees who actually drafted all the sections of the guidelines. And then there were various expert committees that reviewed these documents and added their inputs. These were revised and re-revised, and they were also put up for public consultation as they were posted on the website, and a very large number of comments were received from variety of stakeholders. And thereafter, we had a regional consultation meeting, again involving a number of stakeholders, and then a national consultation meeting where different agencies, members of the Central Ethics Committee on Human Research, people from industry, people from academia and others had participated and given their inputs. And the guidelines were also harmonized and updated in accordance with the various national and international guidelines and regulations. And therefore, we were able to prepare a state-of-the-art document that we have now. And this is just a glimpse of the variety of consultations that we had. And when the guideline was released on 12th of October 2017 by Honorable Minister Shri J.P. Nadda ji and also by Mrs. Anupriya Patel, Minister of State Health and Family Welfare. The guidelines are based on the principles of autonomy, which is respect for person, beneficence, to do good, non-maleficence, to do no harm, and justice, to ensure that there is no discrimination against any individual. It is done in all fairness. So the guidelines are basically based on these principles, and then they have been divided into various sections. The guideline contains 12 sections. The sections that are highlighted in red are the ones that have been recently or newly added, which were not there in the earlier guideline. The first section is on statement of general principles. The second one on general ethical issues. The third one on responsible conduct of research. And this is a totally new section, and it is for the first time that in India we have a guidance on how the research has to be conducted, what are the safeguards that a researcher should take. It also covers areas of authorship, publication ethics. Then we have the expanded section on ethical review procedures, which was there in the earlier guideline, but it has been elaborated now. The next section is a separate section on informed consent. Earlier this was part of the general ethical issues, but now it is a full section where informed consent is discussed in detail. Then we have a section on vulnerable populations. Then the next one on clinical trials, public health research. The public health research section was earlier called as the epidemiology and public health. Now it deals with public health research and the variety of research that is conducted under this gamut. We have a new section on social and behavioral sciences. Then another section on human genetics and behavioral and testing. Biological material, data sets and biobanking is the other section. This is a new section, and we really hope this would be very useful because we receive a lot of concerns related to this area about the secondary use of biological material or leftover samples. Then there is also a new section on research during humanitarian emergencies and disaster research. The scope of the guidelines is that these are applicable to biomedical, socio-behavioral and health research conducted in India involving human participants and their biological material and data. So, as you would note, the scope of the guidelines has been expanded. The general principles. There are 12 general principles that are given in the guidelines. The ones in red are the new principles that have been added. These are all underlying principles that have to be there for any biomedical health research, and that is principle of essentiality that gives the need for research, principle of voluntariness where the researcher should ensure that the participant is voluntarily agreeing to participate in this research, principle of non-exploitation, principle of social responsibility where one has to make sure that the research is in line with the social fabric of the nation and it should not cause disharmony. Principle of ensuring privacy and confidentiality, principle of risk minimization, professional competence, maximization of benefit, totality of responsibility, institutional arrangements, transparency and accountability, and also the newly added principle of environmental protection, where we have to make sure that we conserve our resources that are involved. The section on general ethical issues talks about the variety of issues that have to be considered in any biomedical health research. So, these are common to the variety of research, and these are the benefit risk assessment, privacy confidentiality, payments for participation, payment of compensation in case of any injury, ancillary care, investigator initiated and student research, conflict of interest issues, distributive justice, community engagement, communication of research findings, and post-research access and benefit sharing. So, many of these are newly added general ethical issues, which I will be speaking in a little more detail. So, benefit risk assessment, this is the core fundamental requirement for any biomedical health research and usually done by the ethics committee. So, benefits, as we all know, could be direct or indirect, or they could be directed to the society. But what is important is to be seen that what kind of favorable outcomes are there to the individual, to the society or the community. So, this is the benefits on one hand, and on the other hand one has to see what kind of risk are involved. It need not only be physical risk, it could be psychological, social, economical or legal risk, and it is any kind of discomfort or harm that may come as a result of the study. The guidelines provide the various categories of risk, which could be less than minimal risk or minimal risk, low risk or high risk, and therefore this is a critically important area. Now, payments for participation. There are payments of various kinds that are involved in any research. It could be, for example, in form of reimbursements of expenses, such as for travel or other incidental expenses, or for any inconvenience or time or food or wages lost. So, these are some kind of payments. But what is also important is to see that the participants are not made to pay extra for any extra investigations which are study related interventions or treatments that are part of the research. And also the participants may receive additional medical services at no cost at all. However, all of these payments of various kinds, whether in kind or in cash, have to be declared to the ethics committee, which would like to review and see whether these payments could be accepted, or whether these are a little more and they may become an undue inducement, or if they are less, they may even suggest that some more payments may be made. So, this needs to be reviewed by the ethics committee. The next issue is about privacy and confidentiality. We all know that privacy is the right of an individual to control what information can be collected or stored and by whom, and with whom it could be disclosed. And confidentiality, on the other hand, is obligation of the researchers and the team to safeguard this information from unauthorized access or use or disclosure or modifications. Now, what is important is that the investigator should make all efforts to safeguard this information and the data that belongs to the participant. However, there are certain limits to the confidentiality, which means that the data may be required to be disclosed to certain people, for example, regulatory agencies or to the sponsors, and these limits should also be told to the participants. Any kind of publication that comes out should uphold the privacy of the individual, and in case any photographs or identifying information is going to be published, it should be done with proper masking and after taking appropriate informed consent. Now, compensation for research related harms has been a very contentious issue. It is an ethical requirement that in case there is any injury that is related to the research, a compensation should be made for any direct physical, psychological, social, legal, economic harm that comes out of participation. And this could be in form of financial compensation, or it could also be in form of ancillary care, and the investigator has to report all the adverse events and SAEs, and then the report on relatedness to the ethics committee. What has been proposed in the new guidelines is that institutions have to become very important stakeholder in this exercise, because in an institution there are all kinds of research. All the research is not sponsored by pharmaceutical industry, and they may not be big sponsors who would be willing to give compensation. So what has been suggested is that every institution should plan to have an inbuilt mechanism to be able to provide for compensation. They have to create a corpus funding, and it could be through the overhead charges that they receive from variety of grant applications, or it could be by seeking insurance mechanism, and gradually a corpus fund has to be built within the institution, and therefore any research, whether it is student research or investigator initiated research, if in case there is an injury, the participant, he or she is at no fault and they need to be provided a compensation. Conflict of interest issues. Now, this is another very tricky area because conflicts of interest do exist all the time. And these are often very difficult to recognize because these are at the level of researchers, ethics committee members, even at the level of institutions or sponsors. Now, what is important is it's hard to eliminate them, but what is important is to declare them and manage them. And to be able to do so, institutions have to have inbuilt policies and mechanisms to ensure declaration and management of these conflicts of interest, which are basically secondary interests, which could unduly influence the decisions or outcomes of the research that is conducted in that institution. And the ethics committee needs to evaluate these conflicts of interest and take appropriate measures if required. The details are there in the guideline how to do this. Then the issue of distributive justice, which is so important, that no community or individual should bear the burden of the disease and not be benefited out of it. So basically, they should be selected in such a manner that those who are going to be selected are the ones who bear the burden and benefit, and economically or socially disadvantaged or those who have disabilities should not be used to benefit others. And the research should not lead to any social, racial or ethnic inequalities. And there should be plans for benefit sharing with the contributors who have participated in the research study. And this should be decided a priori, which is before the beginning the study or at the time of planning of the research itself. This has to be built into the protocol. Community engagement is another important aspect that is highlighted in detail in the guidelines. And the communities should be meaningfully engaged before, during and after research. And this could be represented in the form of community advisory boards or community advisory groups. It depends on the kind of research. If there is a community involved, one has to identify ways of engaging with the community. or it could be that the ethics committee may involve or invite special invitee from the community who would represent or be able to provide with information. However, all the community engagement does not at all replace individual informed consent, which remains important. So other than community giving a consent, individual consent is important. And after the study is completed, a meaningful dissemination or sharing back or translating back the outcomes of the research with the community is very important. And this also helps in the being sensitive and understanding about the needs and requirements of the community in the research. Responsible conduct of research is a new section that has been added, and it talks about scientist or the researcher as a responsible member of the society. There is need to have institutional policies, standard operating procedures, conflict of interest policies, monitoring programs, methods of monitoring, and also taking care of misconduct if there is any within the institution. The section describes a detail about how data acquisition, management, sharing, ownership is to be done, and how it has to be reviewed, reported, and what kind of authorship criteria apply, how peer review is to be done. It also describes the need for the Clinical Trial Registry of India, where clinical trials have to be registered, and also not only clinical trials but other biomedical health research can be voluntarily registered. The section also has details on collaborative research, which could be national collaboration within the country, or it could be about international collaboration. So it talks about the various requirements that are there, signing of memorandum of understandings or signing of material transfer agreements if there is any transfer of biological material involved, and seeking health ministry screening clearance in case of international collaboration. Now, there is a very detailed section on ethical review procedures, and this is going to be very useful for ethics committee members, because it discusses how the ethics committee have to be composed, what should be the quorum requirements, who appoints the members of the committee and how they are appointed, what are the terms of reference, what kind of training is required, what are their individual roles and responsibilities, how the ethics committee has to carry out the review, what are the various types of review, the submission procedures, continuing review, site monitoring or monitoring continue in form of annual reviews, and record keeping and archiving. All of these have been discussed in detail. Under the composition and functions, the ethics committees need to be multidisciplinary and multisectoral with age, gender distribution, and also having non-affiliated members. Earlier, the guidelines said that the chairman should not be the head of the institute, and now the guidelines very clearly say that the head of the institute should not be part of the ethics committee, and the ethics committee can have alternate members or subject experts or patient representatives who are non-voting members and who could be invited from time to time based on the needs of the particular research that is going to be reviewed. Every ethics committee should have written SOPs on which they need to function and base their decisions on. They need to protect the research participants, the ethical and community values and customs. It is also important that the ethics committee helps in the development and education of the research community of that institution. They have to bridge the gap between the researchers and the ethics committees, because researchers often see ethics committee as a hurdle, and which is not at all true. The ethics committee have to be partners of research with the researchers and help them in critically understanding and sharing the important requirements in order to make research more ethical and more acceptable. The ethics committee have to work independently, and their appointment, selection, training is at most important. There are special situations that have been described in the guidelines where an institution which is engaged in a lot of research may have more than one ethics committee, or those who don't do much research can use other ethics committees of other institutions after having a proper memorandum of understanding or a policy between the two institutions. Then it also discusses about multi-center research or research review by independent ethics committees and various other subcommittees. Now, this is just a glimpse of how the roles and responsibilities of each member of the ethics committee have been described in the new guidelines. So, for example, for chairperson, whether he should be affiliate or non-affiliate, what should be the qualifications of the person, and the actual role of the chairperson in the ethics committee is described. Similarly, for member secretary, for the basic medical scientist, the social scientist, the legal member, the layperson, because often this was seen as a big problem, because many committees do fulfill the multidisciplinary requirements, but the members are not clear as to what is their role, their actual role in the ethics committee. So this has been given in detail, and we hope that this would be very useful for the ethics committee. And then how does the ethics committee actually review? What do they review? What has been seen is that many ethics committee end up doing a lot of scientific review. Of course, that is needed. Scientific review is very much needed, but it should not be the only review. They have to review the ethics of the proposal, and therefore, we have listed out the things that the ethics committee should review when they are looking at a proposal, and which is the social value of the research, the scientific design and conduct, the benefit risk assessment, how the participants are going to be selected, what kind of payments are involved, what kind of compensation can be provided, what about the privacy and confidentiality, who will have access to all this information, what kind of community considerations are needed, what should be the qualifications, and whether the site has all the required facilities, medical management, and informed consent form, and the process of informed consent, who would do the consenting, where it would be done, in what language it will be done, and how. So all of these have been described and would be useful. Now, this is another new area that has been added, and which is review of multicentric research by a single ethics committee. And this would really help to save time, duplication of efforts, and streamline the review process, where ethics committees of all the participating site, a study which is being done following a common protocol, for example, all these ethics committees or institutions can get together and establish communication with each other and identify one main designated EC. It doesn't mean this is a higher body or anything, but they are all equal, and the local ethics committee has equal responsibility, and they can go through, look at the local requirements, the language translations, and the local issues that are involved in the research, but they could go through a common review by one designated EC whose decision could be acceptable. And in this one main designated EC, the member nominees from other ECs could also go and be part of that review process. But this requires very good communication between the ethics committee secretariats. So for the first time, the concept of common review by one ethics committee has been introduced, and it's a new thing, and we hope it would be useful, and this is especially for research that involves low risk. Then the next section on informed consent talks about the responsibilities of researchers, how the documentation is to be done. It introduces the new concept of electronic consent. It discusses waiver of consent, in what condition the waiver could be done, or re-consent or after consent procedures, special situations where gatekeepers or community consent is to be taken using deception and debriefing. And it describes the various components of the informed consent form, the basic elements of the informed consent form, and also the various alternatives that could also be part of the informed consent form. Vulnerability is the other section where individuals who are relatively or absolutely incapable of protecting their own interests have been discussed in detail if they are involved in research. And therefore, the key principle in such research is that others will be responsible for protecting their interests because they cannot do so, or they are in a compromised position. And also the right, so on one hand there is a right of these individuals to be included in the research. So they should not be as a blanket removed from the research, but if they are included, additional safeguards have to be taken. And these have been described in details, and all the obligations of the researchers, ethics committees, and sponsors are discussed. And on the right side you see all the list of the various vulnerable populations, and sometimes normal healthy volunteers could also be vulnerable in certain situations. So this is also very situational, and all of this has been discussed in detail. Then there's a section on clinical trial which gives the general aspect which is required for a clinical trial, the risk benefit assessments, the GCP, therapeutic misconception, the qualification and the site facilities, etc., etc. So these are all the requirements, but there are some specifics that have been given in the new guidelines which talks about the various ethical issues involved in the various phases of drug development, vaccine trials, BABE studies, placebo use, phytopharmaceuticals, devices, biologicals, biosimilars, stem cells, surgical interventions, community trials, HIV/AIDS trials, traditional medicine, diagnostic agents, etc. So there are a number of situations and different types of trials that have been addressed in this section. And what is very important is for the researchers to be able to discriminate between the trials that require regulatory approval, because all such trials which fall under the purview of Drugs and Cosmetics Act have to additionally follow the requirements as given out by the CDSCO from time to time, as these are applicable. Then the section on public health research talks about this was a very gray area where there was no clear guidance about research such as demographic surveys or registries, program evaluation, surveillance programs, screening programs. So now there is a full section which discusses the variety of responsibilities of the stakeholders in such public health research, what kind of informed consent has to be taken, and how protection can be imparted to the participants, and how to address the conflict of interest issue. The other new section, this is a totally new section actually, on social sciences and behavioral research, which discusses the ethical issues involved in qualitative study designs, how the ethics review have to be done, how benefit risk assessment has to be done, if there is a need to take any community consent, and sharing of data, safety of research teams, and these issues have been discussed in this section. The human genetic testing and research section has been elaborated because there are a number of new issues, new technologies, new procedures that have come up, and it is expected that all the ethical, legal and social issues that are involved in such research should be considered, and the section gives in detail about various requirements when new genetic technology is used or predictive genetic testing is done, where consanguinity is there, how to handle pedigree issues when you are obtaining information from secondary subjects, which is the relatives of the individual, if identifying information is collected, if there are any pictures have to be published, then research that involves prenatal diagnosis or use of newer technologies such as CRISPR, the gene editing, all of these, and then counseling, the importance of counseling in genetic research has been highlighted, and also the need for quality assurance and training in the conduct of this research. A very important new section that is added is on biobanking and data sets, which discusses the types of samples which could be anonymous, so which are totally de-linked, or there is no identifying information, or it could be anonymized, which is that the information has been de-linked or coded. And then there is the third category of sample, which is linked sample, which have the identifying information. So depending on the type of sample, the ethics committee has to look as to what kind of informed consent has to be taken, or whether the ethics committee review could be exempted, or whether the waiver of informed consent could be given, or whether the consent could be, it could be a blanket or broad consent, or it could be a tiered consent or done at a different point of time, or delayed consent. And in case of there is a withdrawal of consent, how the destruction of sample can it be done, and reconsent, such procedures. And also it discusses the governance issues around biobanks or repositories and transfer of biological material. It discusses the issues of ownership or custodianship, because the owner is basically the participant whose sample it is, and the researchers or the institutions are actually the they have to safeguard, and they are the custodians of these samples. The last section is on humanitarian emergencies and disaster situation, a newly added section where it is found that there are situations where preemptive research preparation could be done for future, and protocols could be prepared in advance, informed consent could be planned in advance. However, these have to be very sensitive because of the prevailing emergency situation that is, and all efforts should be made to prevent any stigmatization and to maintain the dignity of the participants and the communities. So this has been discussed in detail in this section. And that was my last one. And this guideline, we really hope that the guideline and the implementation of these guidelines and by researchers and ethics committee members would really help to develop the quality in the ethics procedures that are part of any research protocol, in the ethical conduct and review of any biomedical health research. Thank you very much.